Hi everyone, my name is Michael Sherman. I had the pleasure of reading Isaac Storm by Eric Larson for my book case study. So let's get started. Just a little bit of background information. Eric Larson wanted to delve more into Hurricane Galveston and what happened, so he wanted to actually look into Isaac Klein's perspective. And so Isaac Klein grew up in Tennessee. He's very intelligent, very into science, and he ended up graduating with multiple degrees in physics and Latin and a lot of hard sciences. And then he was recruited into DC as a meteorologist because he was very interested in the weather. And during his time there in receiving training, he studied in his spare time to become a physician. So I thought that was interesting. But he is the chief meteorologist for the Galveston Weather Bureau station, and he specialized in weather forecasting, which back then was a hard thing to do because no one really knew how to do it. So the Weather Bureau ended up moving Isaac Klein down to Galveston in 1889. And then after the storm, he ended up being the chief meteorologist at the Weather Bureau station in New Orleans. And then getting into the location in which was affected by the storm. So I provided a little map so you can actually gain a little perspective in where Galveston actually is. And so Galveston is located on the east coast of Texas, and you see it's not that far from Houston. So it's located on a barrier island, and it was back then it was a thriving city with a population of over 35,000. So it being a port city, it was located on a barrier island, and I thought it was interesting that Galveston was one of the major cities that basically was a trendsetter and ahead of every other city in America during its time. And so a little bit about Eric Larson. So he was a newspaper journalist and an author. So he wrote several similar books, including Devil in the White City, if you all are familiar. So but what he was interested in hurricanes, and so he wasn't too familiar with the Galveston hurricane, and so he noticed that a lot of people were putting this heroic concept behind Isaac Klein, and so he wanted to delve further into the details and actually figure out what happened and why there were so many lives lost, even though Isaac Klein was being idolized as a hero during his time when he was working with the Weather Bureau. And so this was just a newspaper article I found. I just wanted to show you guys some of the articles that were being published in its time. And so talking about how the storm made landfall of September 8th, 1900 in Galveston, Texas, and how it was a Category 4 hurricane with an estimated winds of 145 miles per hour. And so it was the deadliest hurricane in U.S. history, and it was the second costliest hurricane in U.S. history based on the 2005 dollar value. And so we all know Hurricane Katrina was the costliest storm. But it did have a death toll between 600 and 12,000 people. The number was cited in official reports was around 8,000. So to this day, we still aren't really sure the actual amount in which of casualties from the storm. And so just to delve into the Larson's analysis, in order for him to actually analyze the story beyond biased perspectives of Isaac being identified as heroic, he delved into various telegrams, and you can see to the right, this image is a telegram that was sent to Austin to the governor in requesting help, because it's stating that send military supplies, firearms, animal and human food, stuff, danger, food riots, any moment. situation horrible, can't describe, for God's sake help us. And so you can just see how desperate Galveston was in need of assistance after the storm. And so and then Larson also looked into newspaper articles and memoirs of survivors and their families, and also he also looked into the Weather Bureau's reports. And so this is how he conducted his analysis of what happened with the storm, just to build like the full context of the situation and all the conditions surrounding the Galveston hurricane, in comparison to what other authors have written about the storm. So to further dig into his analysis of the Galveston hurricane, he wanted an unbiased perspective and focused on Isaac. So he wanted to look more into how Isaac was a meteorologist at this time working in Galveston. He wanted to see how his roles were before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm. And so he wanted to compare Isaac's responses. He decided to compare Isaac's responses to those with his brother Joseph Klein, who was also a meteorologist. And another focus he looked at the claim in which that Galveston was hurricane proof. So they were saying that in the book that Isaac Klein and the Weather Bureau was stating that Galveston was safe from being struck by hurricanes, and that even if they were, that nothing would happen. And then they were making these claims about how the structures of these houses were so excellent that they would be able to endure a storm if it were to hit. While Joseph, his brother, was emphasizing on how bad he wanted to evacuate the island. And then before the storm, both of the brothers had agreed that the storm was actually coming, and they figured that out maybe it was a day before, and then they issued a hurricane warning, and which was problematic because the Weather Bureau required any meteorologist, any weather station to get permission before issuing a hurricane warning. But throughout the story, you notice that after the effects of the hurricane, Joseph Klein never really mentioned to Isaac that it was his fault, in which why there was a high death toll in Galveston. But eventually, the story gets to how Joseph does not mention anything about how it was basically his fault. So anytime he mentions like his house, talking about the storm, he wouldn't say whose house it was and how it had over 50 people inside of the house during the storm. So so how the storm basically contributed to emergency management. So Isaac Klein determined, first of all, that it wasn't wind that was considered the most dangerous component of hurricanes. It's actually storm surge, which is why they actually had over 15 feet of storm surge over the island. Basically, the island was completely submerged. And so the coastal urban area of any area in the United States is vulnerable to hurricanes because of storm surges. And so regardless of other storms, it was important to actually take these precautions and evacuate from hurricanes. And so the problem with back then that we realized in emergency management that warning systems are very important to have. And so that's why we were also focusing on the communication and coordination with other meteorologists. So in the story, Larson highlighted how Cuba was making these projections in which initially the Weather Bureau thought that the storm was going to go along the east coast of the U.S. and the Cubans knew, they projected that the storm would hit Texas, but the Weather Bureau wanted to block any communication with the Cubans from allowing them to actually disperse this information to the United States. And so warnings weren't even able to go out. The hurricane warnings were given a day before, and striking, and then people actually ignored it. So what was funny is during the actual hurricane, when it was starting to hit, there were people hanging out in downtown in bars, and there was a particular bar that was infamous for people to come to when they were coming to Galveston, and they were talking and they were making jokes about how the storm wasn't water was going through the streets and there was debris floating by, but they didn't realize that until it was too late, that the wind had picked the roof up off the building and it came straight down and took out more than half the people inside of the bar. And so but locals managed the recovery. Overall, there was no executive organization for the recovery, so they were the ones disposing of the dead bodies, whether they were burying them, trying to toss them out at sea, or they were, and then all the debris that they had from all the houses and all the structures, they had to dispose of themselves, and they basically had no assistance from the state or the federal level. And so there was a lack of coordination going on. And then some comparisons to the author's analysis. So my first source I looked at was from Hurricane Science, and so it highlighted the Weather Bureau's wrong forecast, which also what Larson did, and how they ignored the Cuban forecast. And so I thought that was interesting that they were bringing that out. And then Time Magazine, they were also in agreement with Larson's perspective, but they delved further into recovery and addressed future mitigation in terms of building a 17-foot wall, but it still makes the city vulnerable because water could go around the wall easily because of how low, because the highest point on the island is 8 feet above sea level, and with a 17-foot wall, would that actually still be able to hold against future storms? Highly unlikely. And then Texas State Historical Association. So I thought this was interesting because this brought out when city commissions were actually created, because this is what Galveston had to do. The locals took charge in creating this commission to for their recovery efforts and mitigation methods. So they decided to raise all of the structures in Galveston so they wouldn't be as vulnerable to storm surge. And then ABC News, another my other source, the last source, which also agrees with Larson's perspective as well, but it focused more on Isaac Klein's initial report in which he was trying to submit to the Weather Bureau, and his boss decided, no, we're not going to use this report because we wanted to make sure that the Weather Bureau looked good. So the boss rewrote the report to make it look like Klein did a great job and he knew that the hurricane was coming. And this report looked at how how Klein was trying to talk about how much damage there was and all the loss of life, and how to prepare the city for any city whenever they were to come against a hurricane from storm surge. And so I thought that was interesting that they tried to sweep that on the rug for the sake of the image of the Weather Bureau. And so this is my works cited, and I'm looking forward to everyone's comments and feedback. Thank you.